Stay with me, because what happened in the next 5 seconds would destroy a man who thought money could rewrite reality. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, sharp, sudden, final, like something breaking that couldn't be fixed, and for a moment, no one in the room moved, not the server holding a silver tray, not the woman by the window mid-sentence, not even the man in the tailored navy suit who had just stepped back as if nothing had happened, and Emily Carter stood there, 7 months pregnant. Her hand instinctively rising to her temple as the world tilted just slightly off its axis, not enough to fall, not yet, but enough to feel it, the shift, the wrongness, the quiet warning her body was sending before her mind could catch up, and somewhere deep inside her, the baby moved, fast, restless, aware, like it knew something she didn't want to admit. The marble floor beneath her heels suddenly unsteady, the golden light of the restaurant stretching too bright, too sharp, like someone had turned up the contrast on reality itself. And she blinked once, then again, trying to steady her breath, trying to stay present, because losing control here, in front of them, would mean something she couldn't afford, not today, not now, and behind her, a glass tipped over, rolling in a slow, uneven circle across the tablecloth before falling to the floor with a soft, echoing tap that sounded louder than it should have, louder than everything else, louder than the silence that followed, and in that silence, a single thought pressed in: this is being watched. Because it always was, in places like this, with people like him, there were always eyes, always someone recording, always someone waiting for a story to unfold, and Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease, his expression calm, almost bored, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a moment to be smoothed over, managed, erased, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough authority to fill the room without raising it. "She's fine," he said, not looking at her, not really seeing her. "She just lost her balance." And the lie settled into the air like perfume, expensive, deliberate, suffocating, and for a second it almost worked, because that's what power does. It reshapes what people think they saw, it tells them what to believe, it edits reality. In real time, and Emily felt it, that pressure, that expectation to agree, to nod, to play her role, the quiet wife, the graceful one, the one who never made a scene, but her hand was still at her temple, and beneath her fingertips, there was a dull, spreading ache, not sharp, not dramatic, just steady, insistent, like a signal her body refused to ignore. And her vision blurred for a fraction of a second before snapping back into focus, the room rushing in again, the faces, the lights, the silence, and then she saw it, just for a moment, across the room, a phone, held slightly too still, angled just right, recording everything, and something inside her shifted, not fear, not yet, but awareness, because this moment wasn't going to disappear, no matter how much he wanted it to, no matter how carefully he tried to control it. The truth had already been captured, frame by frame, and somewhere deep in her chest. Beneath the confusion, beneath the rising pressure, a quiet realization began to form, slow and undeniable, like a heartbeat you can't unhear. This wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of something far worse for him. The first step felt longer than it should have, as if her body needed permission to move, and when Emily finally shifted her weight forward, the room reacted before she did. Chairs scraping softly against the floor, someone whispering her name, someone else saying something about calling for help, but the words came through like they were underwater, distant and distorted, and she focused instead on something simple, something real. The steady rhythm of her own breathing, in and out, slow and controlled, because losing that rhythm meant losing everything, and she could not afford that, not with the child she carried, not with the eyes now fixed on her every movement. And the baby responded again, a firm, unmistakable motion beneath her hand, grounding her, anchoring her to something that mattered more than the man standing a few feet away pretending none of this was happening, and for a brief second she closed her eyes. Not in weakness but in calculation, because somewhere between the moment the room went quiet and the moment the phone across the room began capturing everything, the rules had changed, and when she opened them again she did not look at Richard first, she looked at the reflection in the glass wall behind him, watching him without giving him the satisfaction of her direct attention, studying the way his posture remained relaxed, the way his shoulders did not tense, The way his expression held that same polished calm he used in boardrooms and interviews. And that was when she understood something that settled deeper than fear, deeper than pain, something colder. He believed this would disappear. He believed he could step out of this moment the same way he stepped out of contracts, of obligations, of people, clean and untouched. And that belief was his first mistake, because across the room the phone lowered slightly and a second one appeared, then a third, subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it. But Emily saw it, she saw all of it, the shift in the air, the quiet alignment of witnesses, the way silence was no longer protecting him but isolating him. And somewhere behind her a voice finally cut through clearly, "We should get you checked." Gentle but firm, and she turned just enough to acknowledge it, offering a small nod, controlled, deliberate, because every movement now carried meaning, every reaction would be interpreted, replayed, examined, and she would not give them chaos, she would give them clarity. And when she finally looked at Richard, his eyes met hers for the first time since it happened, just for a fraction of a second. And in that glance there was something almost imperceptible, not guilt, not regret, but a flicker of irritation, as if she had failed to follow the script he expected, as if her silence was not submission but resistance. And that flicker told her everything she needed to know, because it confirmed what she had already begun to feel. This was not over, not even close. And as she turned toward the exit, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach, the room parted for her without a word. And the sound of her footsteps against the polished floor echoed just enough to mark the moment, not as an ending, but as the first step in something that would not be contained, not by him, not by money, not by the carefully constructed version of reality he had spent years building, because the truth had already begun to move, quietly, steadily, and once it started, it did not stop. The night air outside felt colder than it should have, or maybe it was just the way her body was trying to recalibrate, shifting from controlled composure to something more fragile the moment the glass doors closed behind her, and Emily paused on the top step, one hand lightly gripping the railing, the other still resting over her stomach as if confirming what mattered most was still there, still steady, still fighting with her. And for a second the city lights blurred again, stretching into long streaks of gold and white before settling back into place, and that was when she knew this was no longer something she could ignore or push through, because this was not just about dignity anymore, this was medical, real, measurable, and dangerous in ways that did not announce themselves loudly, and a black car pulled up at the curb almost immediately. Summoned by someone inside or perhaps by the staff who understood situations like this needed quiet handling, and the driver stepped out, opening the door with a practiced calm that did not ask questions, and she slid into the back seat slowly, deliberately, lowering herself with care as if any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile balance her body was trying to maintain, and the moment the door closed the silence wrapped around her again, thicker now, more personal, and she let her head rest lightly against the seat, eyes closing just long enough to steady the spinning sensation that had not fully left, and her phone buzzed in her hand, once, then again, and when she looked down the screen was already filling with messages, names she recognized, names she did not, notifications stacking faster than she could process, because what happened inside had not stayed inside, it never did, not in a world where everything could be captured, shared, replayed within minutes, and a short clip had already begun to circulate, shaky but clear enough. A fragment of a moment that refused to disappear, and she did not press play. She did not need to, because she had lived it, and the driver's voice came gently from the front, asking for a destination, and she answered without hesitation, the name of a hospital she trusted, one that understood both discretion and urgency. And as the car pulled into traffic she felt the subtle shift again, that internal pressure behind her eyes, not sharp, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a signal she could not silence, and her breathing slowed as she counted each inhale, each exhale, anchoring herself in something predictable while everything else accelerated beyond her control, and somewhere between the second and third intersection her phone rang, a number she knew by heart, and for a moment she hesitated, because answering would mean saying it out loud, making it real in a way that silence could still delay, but the call continued, steady, insistent, and she accepted it, lifting the phone to her ear, and before she could speak the voice on the other end did, calm, precise, unmistakably controlled. "Emily, I just saw the footage." And the world seemed to narrow to that single sentence, because there was no panic in it, no confusion, only clarity, and that clarity carried something far more powerful than emotion. It carried direction, and Emily swallowed, her voice quieter than she expected but steady enough to hold. "I am on my way to the hospital." And there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but calculation, and then the response came, measured and exact. "Good, do not let anyone examine you without full documentation. I am on my way." And the line went silent, and in that silence something shifted again, not in the room, not in the world outside, but inside her, because the moment her mother spoke, this stopped being an incident and became a case. And as the city lights moved past the window in long, uninterrupted lines, Emily Carter understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Richard Hale believed he could control had already slipped beyond his reach, and it was not coming back. The emergency entrance doors slid open with a quiet mechanical hum, and the fluorescent lights inside felt harsher than anything outside, too bright, too honest, as if nothing here allowed shadows to hide in, and Emily stepped forward slowly, her movements measured, controlled, each step deliberate not just for balance but for clarity, because every second now mattered, every detail would matter later. And the nurse at the front desk looked up immediately, her professional smile fading the moment she registered the situation, not because of what Emily said, but because of how she carried herself, composed but fragile in a way that signaled urgency without chaos, and within seconds a wheelchair was offered, gentle, respectful, not forced, and Emily accepted it without protest, lowering herself carefully, conserving energy, protecting stability, and as she was guided through the hallway the sounds of the hospital wrapped around her, monitors beeping in steady rhythms, distant voices calling out instructions, the quiet urgency of a place where truth was measured in data, not opinions, and that difference mattered now more than ever. Because opinions could be dismissed, but numbers could not, and as she was wheeled into a private examination room the door closed behind her with a soft click that felt final, like crossing into a space where the narrative could no longer be rewritten by anyone but the facts themselves, and a doctor entered shortly after, calm, attentive, already reviewing the intake notes, asking questions in a steady tone that did not rush, did not assume, and Emily answered each one clearly, describing what she felt, the dizziness, the pressure, the brief loss of visual stability, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just stating what was real, and the doctor nodded, documenting everything, ordering scans, requesting imaging, building a record that would exist long after the moment had passed, and for a brief second Emily allowed herself to close her eyes again, not from weakness but from focus, holding on to the rhythm of her breathing as machines were prepared around her, as the process began. And then the door opened again, not rushed, not loud, but with a presence that shifted the entire room instantly, and Dr. Margaret Carter stepped inside, her posture straight, her expression composed to the point of stillness, the kind of stillness that did not come from calm but from control, and her eyes moved quickly, assessing, calculating, not just as a mother but as a neurologist who had spent decades understanding what could not be seen on the surface, and for a brief moment their eyes met. And nothing needed to be said, because everything had already been understood, and Margaret turned to the attending physician with a tone that was professional, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. "I want full imaging, including MRI, and I want every symptom documented in sequence." And there was no challenge to her authority, no hesitation, because her presence alone carried weight, and as the process accelerated Emily felt something shift again, not physically this time, but strategically, because this was no longer about explaining what happened. It was about proving what could not be denied, and as she was guided toward the imaging room, the quiet hum of machines waiting ahead, her phone buzzed once more on the tray beside her, a notification flashing briefly before the screen dimmed, and though she did not pick it up, she already knew what it contained. The story was spreading, faster than anyone could contain, and for the first time since the night began. Emily did not feel like she was reacting to something, she felt like she was moving forward into it, step by step, record by record, truth by truth, and somewhere behind her, just outside the room, Dr. Margaret Carter was already making another call, her voice low, controlled, carrying a single sentence that would change everything that followed. "Prepare the legal team, we are not waiting." The MRI machine hummed with a low, steady rhythm that seemed almost mechanical in its indifference, a sound that did not react, did not judge, did not care who she was or who he was, only what was real beneath the surface. And Emily lay still as instructed, her body aligned within the narrow space, her hands resting lightly over her stomach as if anchoring herself to something constant while everything else was being examined, measured, recorded in slices of data that would outlive the moment. And the technician's voice came through calm and clear, guiding her through each phase, telling her when to breathe, when to hold, when to remain completely still, and she followed every instruction precisely, because this was no longer about discomfort or fear, this was about evidence, and evidence required discipline, and as the scan continued her mind did not wander, it sharpened, focusing on the sequence of events, the timing, the details. Replaying them not emotionally but structurally. Because somewhere outside this room those details were already being questioned, reframed, reshaped, and she would not allow that to stand unchallenged. And when the skin finally ended and the table slid back out into the open air, the transition felt subtle but significant, like stepping out of silence into consequence. And within minutes she was guided back to the examination room where Dr. Margaret Carter was already reviewing preliminary images on a screen, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not know her. But Emily knew, she recognized the slight narrowing of her mother's eyes, the way her focus tightened, the absence of any unnecessary movement, and that absence meant one thing, confirmation, and the attending physician stood beside her, explaining carefully, pointing to areas on the scan, describing what they were seeing in clinical terms that carried weight precisely because they avoided drama, and Emily listened, absorbing each word, each phrase. Because this was the language that would matter later, the language that could not be dismissed as emotional or exaggerated, and her mother finally spoke, her voice even, controlled, but carrying a precision that cut through everything else in the room. "Document the concussion diagnosis clearly and include all observed symptoms with timestamps." And there was no hesitation in the response, no question about authority. Because her expertise was not something that needed to be announced, it was recognized, and as the documentation process began, forms being filled, reports being generated, digital records being secured, the situation shifted again from immediate care to structured accountability, and Emily felt it in the way the room operated now, no longer reactive but methodical, building something piece by piece that could not be undone, and her phone, placed carefully beside her, lit up once more, this time with a notification that lingered just long enough for her to read the headline forming in real time. Words that framed the event not as an isolated incident but as a public story, one that was gaining traction, and she did not reach for it, she did not engage with it, because what mattered was happening here, in this room, in these records, in the quiet but relentless process of turning truth into proof, and Dr. Margaret Carter stepped slightly aside, making another call. Her tone unchanged, calm but absolute. "We have imaging confirmation and a documented diagnosis. Proceed with filing immediately." And the words settled into the space with a finality that no one could ignore, because this was the moment where everything crossed from private to irreversible, and as Emily sat there, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach, she realized that whatever control had existed before this night was gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Something that did not rely on perception or influence, but on facts that could not be negotiated away. And in that realization there was no fear left, only clarity, because the truth was no longer something that needed to be defended, it was something that would now speak for itself. The hospital corridor outside the examination room had changed in tone without anyone announcing it, the quiet urgency now layered with something sharper, more deliberate. As if every step taken, every voice lowered, carried the awareness that this was no longer routine, and Emily could feel it even without leaving her chair, the shift in energy that followed decisions already set in motion. And through the partially open doors she caught fragments of conversation, legal terms spoken in calm, measured voices, Phrases like documented injury, timeline verification, witness corroboration, each one precise, each one building something that could not be undone once completed, and inside the room her world had narrowed to a smaller, more controlled space, the steady hum of equipment now replaced by the soft tapping of keys as records were finalized, timestamps locked, digital signatures applied, and she sat quietly. Not withdrawn but focused, her hands still resting over her stomach. Feeling the subtle, reassuring movements that grounded her in something real, something unaffected by everything unfolding beyond the walls, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe without counting, without measuring, just letting the air move naturally as her mind caught up to the speed of what was happening, because only hours ago this had been a private moment, contained within a single room, a single interaction. And now it was expanding outward, touching systems, institutions, people she had never met, and it would not contract again, not after this point, and the door opened once more, and Margaret stepped back in, not hurried, not tense, but with a presence that filled the room more completely than before, as if the decisions made outside had solidified into something tangible, and she moved closer, her gaze softening just slightly when it met Emily's. A brief acknowledgement of the personal beneath the professional, and then it returned to its usual clarity, her voice steady. "The report is complete and the filing is in motion." And the words were simple, almost understated, but their meaning carried weight far beyond their tone, because they marked a transition that could not be reversed, and Emily nodded once, not in agreement but in understanding, because there was nothing to agree with anymore, only consequences that would now unfold, and her phone vibrated again, this time longer, more insistent. And she glanced at it briefly, just enough to see the number before setting it back down, because she already knew who it was, and answering now would not change anything, not for him, not for her, and Margaret noticed the movement, her eyes flicking to the screen for a fraction of a second before returning to Emily, and there was no question asked, no need for explanation. Only a quiet statement delivered with the same precision she had used all night. "Do not engage directly, everything will go through counsel now." And the instruction settled into place like another layer of protection, another boundary that shifted control away from emotion and into structure, and outside the room footsteps passed more frequently now, the subtle increase in activity signaling that the story had moved beyond this floor, beyond this building, into spaces where narratives were shaped and reputations tested, and Emily felt it. Not as pressure but as distance, because whatever storm was building out there no longer reached her the same way, not with the records secured, not with the process already underway, and she leaned back slightly, allowing her body a moment of stillness, her hand resting over her stomach as the baby moved again, slower now, calmer, as if responding to the shift she felt herself, and in that quiet, controlled space, surrounded by evidence, by decisions already set in motion. Emily Carter understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was no longer about surviving what happened, it was about what would happen next, and for the first time since the night began, she was not waiting for it, she was ready for it. The call came exactly when the room had settled into that fragile balance between action and waiting, the kind of silence that only exists when everything important has already been decided and nothing can be taken back. And Emily did not need to look at the screen to know it would not stop, because people like him did not accept silence as an answer, they filled it, pushed against it, tried to reshape it into something they could control. And the phone vibrated again against the tray, steady, persistent, almost impatient, and this time Margaret reached for it before Emily could, her movements smooth, deliberate, as if she had been expecting this exact moment, and she glanced at the screen briefly, confirming what was already obvious, before placing it back down untouched, her voice calm but final. "He will escalate now." And the statement was not emotional, not reactive, it was predictive, based on patterns, on years of observing how power behaves when it begins to slip, and outside the room the corridor grew busier, footsteps sharper, voices lower but faster, and somewhere in that movement a different kind of presence entered, not medical, not administrative, but legal, and within minutes a man in a dark suit appeared at the doorway, his posture composed, his expression neutral in the way only someone trained to separate fact from narrative could maintain, and he introduced himself briefly, not with unnecessary formality but with efficiency, because time now had a different value, and Margaret acknowledged him with a slight nod, the exchange between them silent but complete. As if an entire strategy had just been confirmed without needing to be spoken out loud, and Emily watched this shift unfold, not as an outsider but as the center of it, understanding that the room she sat in had become something else entirely, no longer just a place of care, but the starting point of a case that would extend far beyond these walls. And the attorney stepped closer, his tone measured, respectful, but precise, asking for confirmation of details, times, sequence. And Emily answered each question clearly, her voice steady, because by now the events no longer felt chaotic, they felt structured, organized into a timeline that could be followed, verified, proven, and as she spoke, the phone lit up again, this time not a call but a message, and even from where she sat she could see the preview, a short line that carried more weight than any explanation. "We need to talk before this goes further." And for a brief moment the room seemed to pause around that sentence, not physically, but in awareness, because that was how it always began, the attempt to contain, to negotiate, to pull things back into a space where influence could still operate, and Margaret's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the phone but toward Emily, a silent reminder that this moment was critical, that any response now would shape what followed, and Emily did not reach for the device, she did not acknowledge the message, because she understood something now with a clarity that had taken years to form. Silence was no longer weakness, it was control, and the attorney observed this without comment, making a brief note, already incorporating the lack of response into the larger strategy, and outside, somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the story continued to spread, faster now, moving through networks that did not wait for permission, reshaping the narrative in real time. And inside the room everything remained steady, deliberate, untouched by that chaos, because here, the only thing that mattered was what could be proven, and Margaret finally spoke again, her voice quiet but absolute. "From this point forward, everything is documented, everything is preserved, and everything is pursued." And the words settled into the space like a line drawn with precision, not dramatic, not loud, but permanent, and Emily felt it, not as pressure but as alignment, because for the first time since the night began, every element was moving in the same direction, every piece fitting into place, and whatever came next would not be decided by who had more power, but by who had the truth, and that difference would change everything. By the time the first official statement appeared online, the narrative had already begun to fracture in two different directions, one controlled, polished, carefully worded, and the other raw, unfiltered, built from fragments of video and eyewitness accounts that did not wait for permission to be shared, and Emily could feel that shift even without opening her phone, because the energy inside the room changed again, not chaotic, not rushed, but sharpened, as if every person present understood that what had been internal was now external, and once something entered the public space, it followed a different set of rules, and the attorney stepped slightly aside, checking his own device briefly before returning his attention to Emily and Margaret, his tone steady but carrying a new layer of urgency. "They have released a preliminary statement." And he did not need to specify who they were, because there was only one side that would move this quickly to regain control, and Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes narrowed just slightly, the only visible sign that she had anticipated this exact move, and she responded without hesitation. "We expected that." And the simplicity of her reply carried weight, because it meant this was not a reaction, it was part of a sequence already mapped out, and Emily sat quietly, listening, her hands still resting over her stomach as the baby moved in slow, steady patterns, grounding her in a rhythm that felt separate from everything unfolding beyond the walls, and the attorney continued, summarizing the statement in precise terms, explaining how it framed the situation as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate moment taken out of context. Language designed to soften, to redirect, to create doubt where clarity had already begun to form, and for a brief second the room seemed to hold that information in suspension, not absorbing it emotionally but analyzing it structurally, and Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying an edge that was impossible to ignore. "Then we respond with facts." And there was no emphasis, no raised tone, just certainty, because facts did not compete with narratives, they replaced them, and she turned slightly toward the attorney, outlining the next steps with the same precision she had maintained all night, referencing the imaging, the documentation, the timeline, each element positioned not as a reaction but as a countermeasure already prepared, and Emily listened, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but aware that this moment marked another transition, from quiet preparation to controlled exposure, and her phone lit up again. This time with notifications that no longer came one at a time but in clusters, headlines forming, discussions building, opinions spreading faster than any single person could track, and she glanced at the screen briefly, just enough to see the contrast between what was being said and what she knew to be true, and then she set it back down, because engaging with that space now would only blur what had already been made clear here, in this room, in these records, and the attorney nodded once, finalizing something on his device before looking back at Margaret. "We can file publicly within the hour." And the statement settled into the room, like a countdown beginning, quiet but irreversible, and Margaret gave a small nod in return, not dramatic, not forceful, just definitive, and then she turned her attention back to Emily, her voice softer now, but no less certain. "This will move quickly from here." And Emily met her gaze, not searching for reassurance but acknowledging what had already been set in motion, because there was no turning point left, no moment where things could be pulled back into privacy, and as the seconds passed the weight of that reality did not feel heavy, it felt clear, because everything that followed would no longer depend on interpretation or influence, it would depend on what had already been secured, documented, and preserved, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, beyond the screens and statements and shifting narratives, the truth was already moving forward, steady and uncontained, and this time it was not something that could be rewritten. The moment the filing went public, everything accelerated in a way that no one in the room needed to announce, because they could feel it in the sudden shift of attention, the quiet vibration of devices no longer isolated to a single screen but echoing across multiple channels at once, and the attorney's phone lit up again almost instantly, not with uncertainty but with confirmation. The kind that signaled the process had crossed into a space where it would now move on its own momentum, and he glanced down briefly before speaking, his tone unchanged but carrying a finality that settled into the room. "It is live." And those two words carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because they marked the exact point where control no longer belonged to one side or the other, but to the record itself. And Emily felt it in the way the silence around her changed, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but resolved, as if something had clicked into place that could not be undone. And she exhaled slowly, not from relief but from recognition, because this was the moment where everything that had been documented, measured, and preserved began to speak beyond the walls of this room, and Margaret stood beside her, her posture unchanged, her focus unwavering, but there was a subtle shift in her presence, not softer, not lighter, but complete. As if the strategies she had been building since the first phone call had now reached its intended point of release, and outside the door, the movement in the corridor increased again, voices slightly louder now, more frequent, because the story had reached the public domain in a way that demanded response, and responses were already forming, not just from one side but from many, and Emily's phone lit up once more, the screen filling with headlines that no longer questioned what had happened but reported on what had been filed, what had been confirmed, what had been supported by evidence, and she did not need to read them fully to understand the shift, because the language had changed, from speculation to documentation, from narrative to fact, and that difference mattered more than anything else, and across the room the attorney nodded once, already moving into the next phase, coordinating statements, preparing responses, ensuring that every piece of information released aligned exactly with what had been recorded, nothing more, nothing less, because precision now was not just important, it was decisive, and Margaret turned slightly, her attention returning to Emily with that same steady clarity, her voice quiet but grounded. "From here, it moves through the system." And there was no explanation needed, because the system she referred to was not abstract. It was structured, defined, built to process exactly this kind of moment when evidence demanded accountability, and Emily met her gaze, understanding fully. Because for the first time since the night began, there was no uncertainty left about what would happen next, not in the details, not in the timeline, but in the direction, and her hand remained over her stomach, feeling the steady movement beneath, a reminder that through everything, something constant remained, something that had been protected, prioritized, and now stood at the center of every decision made, and outside. Beyond the hospital, beyond the screens and statements and shifting reactions, the consequences had already begun to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably, step by step, record by record, and inside the room, surrounded by the quiet certainty of documented truth, Emily Carter understood that whatever power had once stood against her was now facing something it could not negotiate with, something it could not silence. Something that would continue forward regardless of influence or denial, because once the truth is placed into the record, it does not wait, and it does not stop. The first counterattack did not come through headlines or public statements, it came quietly, directly, in the form of a formal request delivered within minutes of the filing going live, and the attorney's phone vibrated once before he read it, his expression unchanged but his posture shifting slightly, a subtle indication that the next phase had begun exactly as expected, and he looked up, his voice calm but precise. "They are requesting immediate mediation and a temporary hold." And the words settled into the room with a familiar weight, not surprising, not disruptive, but confirming a pattern that had already been anticipated, because when control begins to slip, the first instinct is always to contain, to slow, to negotiate terms before the full impact can take hold, and Margaret did not respond immediately, her gaze steady, her mind already several steps ahead, and when she spoke her tone carried no hesitation. "We decline." And the simplicity of the answer carried more force than any extended explanation, because it made one thing clear: there would be no pause, no adjustment, no return to private negotiation, and the attorney nodded once, already documenting the response, already preparing the next communication, because every move now was part of a sequence that had to remain exact, and Emily sat quietly, observing the exchange, feeling the shift not as tension but as direction. Because each decision now reinforced the same path forward, one that did not rely on persuasion but on process, and her phone lit up again, this time with a different kind of message, not from him, but from someone within his circle, the tone carefully worded, attempting distance while still reaching out. "This is getting out of control, there are ways to resolve this privately." And she read it once, not reacting, not engaging, because the language was familiar, the attempt to redefine this situation as something manageable, something negotiable, and she set the phone down. Without responding, her silence no longer uncertain but deliberate, and across the room Margaret watched that small action, her expression unchanged but her approval clear in the absence of correction, and outside the hospital the situation was evolving rapidly, legal analysts beginning to comment, media outlets updating their coverage with the newly filed details. Each edition reinforcing the structure that had been built inside this room, and the attorney spoke again, outlining the implications of the declined request, explaining how it would push the case forward more quickly, how it would limit the opposing side's ability to control the pace, and Margaret listened, then gave a small nod, confirming what had already been decided, because speed now was not a risk, it was an advantage, and Emily leaned back slightly, allowing her body a moment of stillness as the world beyond the walls continued to accelerate. And she focused again on the steady movement beneath her hand. The quiet reminder of what all of this was centered around, and in that moment the contrast became clear, between what they were trying to protect and what he was trying to preserve, because one was built on truth, on evidence, on something that could not be reshaped once recorded, and the other relied on perception, on influence, on timing that was already slipping away, and as the attorney finalized the response, sending it out with the same precision that had defined every step so far, the room settled once more into that controlled silence, not empty, not uncertain, but complete, because the offer to contain had been rejected, the attempt to slow had been denied, and what remained now was only forward movement, steady and irreversible, and Emily Carter understood that from this point on, there would be no quiet resolution, no closed-door agreement. Only the full weight of what had been documented moving through a system designed to bring it into the light, and once that process begins, it does not ask permission to continue. By the time the courthouse doors opened the next morning, the atmosphere had already shifted from speculation to anticipation, and the crowd gathering outside was not loud, not chaotic, but focused, cameras positioned with intention, reporters speaking in measured tones as if they understood that this was no longer just another headline but a case that had begun to carry weight beyond its initial moment, and inside. The polished floors reflected the steady movement of people who knew exactly where they needed to be, attorneys with files held close, assistants moving quickly but quietly, every step contributing to a rhythm that felt structured, inevitable, and Emily walked through it all with a calm that had not existed the night before, her pace steady, her posture composed, one hand resting lightly over her stomach as if maintaining that same anchor she had carried through every stage of what had unfolded. And beside her Margaret moved with equal precision, her presence commanding. Without effort, the kind of authority that did not need to be announced because it was already recognized, and as they approached the courtroom doors the attorney turned slightly, offering a final briefing in a voice that remained even, controlled, outlining what would happen next, how the evidence would be introduced, how the sequence would be presented, each detail reinforcing the structure they had built since the moment the first record was created, and Emily listened, not absorbing it as new information but as confirmation of what she already understood, because by now the case no longer felt uncertain, it felt defined, and when the doors opened the shift was immediate, the quiet murmur of the courtroom settling into stillness as they entered, eyes turning not with curiosity but with recognition. Because the story had already reached this room before they did, and now it was no longer a story, it was a matter to be examined, to be weighed, to be placed into a record that would not change once it was established, and Emily took her seat, her movements controlled, deliberate, her focus steady as she looked forward, not toward the opposing side, not toward the audience, but toward the space where the truth would be presented, and across the room Richard sat with his legal team, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral, but there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable, the confidence that had once defined his presence replaced by something more calculated, more contained, as if he understood that this environment operated by rules he could not influence in the same way, and the proceedings began without delay, the judge's voice clear, measured, setting the tone for everything that would follow, and when the first piece of evidence was introduced it was not dramatic, not exaggerated, it was precise, documented, supported by timestamps and records that aligned exactly with what had been prepared, and Margaret took the stand with the same calm authority she had carried from the hospital, her testimony structured, clinical, explaining the medical findings in terms that did not rely on emotion but on fact, each statement building on the last with a clarity that left no space for reinterpretation, and as she spoke the room remained silent. Not out of tension but out of focus, because every word contributed to something that could not be undone once entered into the record, and Emily sat quietly, listening, her hand still resting over her stomach, feeling that steady movement that had remained constant through everything, and in that moment the contrast became complete, between what had been claimed and what was now being proven, between perception and documentation, and as the evidence continued to be presented, step by step, record by record, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was no longer a matter of competing narratives, it was a matter of established fact, and once fact is placed into the record, it does not ask for belief, it demands acknowledgement. The turning point did not arrive with a raised voice or a dramatic interruption, it came in the form of a screen lighting up at the front of the courtroom, a simple projection that carried more weight than any argument that had been made so far, and the attorney stepped forward with measured precision, his tone steady as he introduced the next piece of evidence, not as a surprise, not as a tactic, but as a continuation of the record that had been built step by step since the night before, and the video began to play, not loudly, not sensationally, but clearly enough that every movement, every moment, could be seen without interpretation, and the room did not react immediately, because it did not need to. The clarity of what was being presented spoke without assistance, and Margaret remained seated, her posture unchanged, her focus forward, allowing the evidence to exist on its own terms. Because that was where its power came from, not from explanation but from visibility, and Emily sat still, her breathing steady, her hand resting over her stomach as she watched not with shock but with recognition, because she had already lived the moment that was now being observed by others. And across the room Richard's posture shifted for the first time, subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders tightening slightly, his attention no longer controlled but fixed. Because what was now being presented could not be redirected or reframed in the way words could, and when the video ended the silence that followed was different from any before, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had been confirmed that no longer required discussion, and the attorney did not rush to fill that silence, he allowed it to exist, because it carried its own weight, and when he spoke again it was only to connect what had been seen with what had already been documented, referencing the medical findings, the timeline, the consistency between the visual record and the clinical report, each element aligning with precision, and Margaret was called again, her voice calm as she explained how the observed event correlated directly with the diagnosis, how the symptoms matched the documented findings, how the sequence of events formed a complete and consistent pattern that could not be attributed to chance or misunderstanding, and her words did not rise, did not push, they simply clarified, and that clarity removed the last space where doubt could exist, and Emily felt it not as a release but as a completion. Because everything that had been uncertain at the beginning of the night had now been placed into a structure that did not rely on interpretation, and the judge listened without interruption, reviewing the materials with the same measured attention that defined the room, and when the opposing counsel finally stood, their tone was controlled, their language careful. But the difference was clear, they were no longer shaping the narrative, they were responding to it, adjusting to a framework that had already been established, and as they spoke, attempting to reframe, to soften, to introduce alternative perspectives, the contrast became even more apparent, because their words required explanation, while the evidence required none, and when they finished, the room returned to stillness once more, the kind of stillness that does not come from waiting, but from knowing that something has already shifted beyond reversal, and Emily sat quietly, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, because this was not a moment of victory, not yet. It was a moment of truth fully entering the record, and once that happens, the outcome is no longer uncertain, it is only a matter of time. The final moment did not arrive with noise, it arrived with stillness, the kind that settles over a room when every argument has already been made and nothing remains except the weight of what has been proven, and the judge's voice carried through that stillness with measured clarity, not raised, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no space for reinterpretation, and as the decision was read, each word aligned with everything that had been placed into the record, the documentation, the medical findings, the sequence of events, the evidence that had stood on its own without needing to be defended, and Emily listened without moving, her posture unchanged, her hand still resting over her stomach, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required recognition, and across the room Richard remained seated, his expression controlled but no longer composed in the way it had been before, the certainty that once defined him replaced by something quieter, something that could not be adjusted or redirected now that the outcome had been established within a system he could not influence. And when the judge finished speaking, the silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not heavy, not tense, but complete, as if the room itself acknowledged that the process had reached its conclusion. And the attorney beside Emily gathered his files with precise movements, no rush, no excess, because there was nothing left to secure, everything had already been placed where it needed to be, and Margaret stood, her presence steady, her gaze briefly meeting Emily's, not with relief, not with celebration, but with a quiet understanding that what had been done was necessary, and Emily rose as well, her movements deliberate, her balance steady. Because the uncertainty that had once followed each step was no longer there, replaced by a clarity that extended beyond this room, beyond this moment, and as they turned toward the exit the doors opened once more, revealing the corridor filled with waiting eyes, cameras held ready, voices prepared to capture what would come next. But Emily did not pause, she did not look toward them, because what mattered had already happened inside, within the record. within the system that had taken everything presented and placed it into a conclusion that could not be undone, and as she walked forward the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor, each step measured, each movement controlled, and the world outside continued to move, to react, to interpret, but none of that reached her in the same way anymore, because the truth no longer needed to be argued, it had already been acknowledged, and as she stepped beyond the courthouse doors into the open air, the light felt different, not brighter, not softer, but clearer. And her hand remained over her stomach, feeling the steady, quiet movement that had been constant through everything, the one thing that had not shifted, not changed, not been influenced by anything beyond its own existence. And she paused for just a fraction of a second, not to look back, but to breathe, to recognize the distance between where this began and where it had ended, and then she moved forward again, leaving behind a room where power had been measured not by wealth or influence, but by truth, and in that space, truth had not needed to speak loudly, it had only needed to exist, because in the end, the loudest thing in the room was not what was said, but what could no longer be denied.